Just going to get set up here. Give it a few more seconds. Taking another sip of water because Chapter 12 was it was a behemoth, ladies and gentlemen. All right. So now that I've gotten my sip of water, I've gotten the chance to gather some of my thoughts because, again, Chapter 12 is just an absolute behemoth of a chapter. Today, we come to you live with the conclusion to Gears of War Ascendance, my Cliff Notes, Spark Notes, whatever you want to look at it as. Amazing book. I'd recommend it to each and every person in the community and even outside because it is so masterfully written and well done. But enough with the niceties. Let us get back to the action. We come to Chapter 12. And the last thing we thought about, the last thing we heard was Kate Diaz sinking herself down into that lake. And the last thing she can hear is that beautiful yell of the coal train baby. The hype never stops for that man. We open the chapter with Del shouting orders to Sam of where and how to maneuver that King Raven. She's going to sweep it expertly, allowing Coltrane to take a position on the opposite side of that cargo hold and shoot out of the other chain gun, the one that was not ripped out by the carrier, but on the opposite side of the King Raven. And she's basically just making this huge 180-degree sweep across the landscape, throwing round after round. The Coltrane is blasting rounds into one of those two speakers, and they don't see the second one, and Del can only hope that it's already been ripped to shreds and has been put into the water face down, probably, and hopefully ending its life. Sam then sweeps that King Raven around to the edge of the beach where they were all stationed, where that bonfire was, and brings it down to a hover of about 5 feet. Once she gets to that kind of leveled off hovering position, Del and JD need no orders. They need no push. They immediately hop out. They land on the ground. They're knee deep in sand, muck, mud, whatever you want to look at it as, but it's gonna drag them down just a hair. They both carry brand new weapons that were on the King Raven already that Baird had brought with him as kind of an aerial arsenal, or an arsenal to give them when he picked them up from Orzabal Crater. Del's carrying a fresh Gnasher filled with ammo, a couple extra shells on him, and JD, interestingly enough, chooses a torque bow as his weapon of choice, truly showing off those marksman skills that we heard about from Del in previous chapters, which is why he gave him the breach shot with that single shot to make the shot to close that back ramp for the Condor to be able to bring it to them to save them. Sam would then rise up back away from Del and JD and begin flying over toward that Swarmock. She'd unleash a salvo into its back while it is still facing that lumber mill, and it will connect with all 8 rockets. They find their mark. The Swarmac is going to turn and writhe, ripping that piece of the wall off. It's now facing in the direction of the King Raven. Its job is complete. It caused enough of a distraction. But inside, the problem that they're having is, even though the explosions will cause a distraction, the Swarmac won't immediately be able to kill anybody on the inside of that lumber mill. The force and the sheer heat sent Oscar flailing to the ground. He's going to spring back up quicker than he has in so many years, quicker than he can even remember being able to. But as the Swarmac falls back into the building, kind of elbowing it, kind of messing with the building yet again, it's actually going to cause it to rupture, shake. The floor underneath Oscar's feet is going to give way. He's going to grab onto that ledge, the closest ledge that he can, try not to fall into that abyss. The twins will rush for him, each grabbing onto an arm, begin pulling at him. Oscar knows that if that Swarmac turns back around, they are good as dead. He tells them to just go. The twins know better, though. They know that the Swarmac's attention has been turned. They continue to pull, rip, and claw to try to get Oscar back onto level ground. He feels the roar of the Swarmac and thought the end was near, but it would not be. the twins would get him back up onto that ground. He would be able to turn, see that the KR has gotten that full attention of the Swarmak, and as Sam would fire a second salvo, it was about 100 meters away. It was a little further than that first one. The Swarmak has a chance to dodge the first 4 of the 8 missiles. Those careen and hit the lumber mill, and as the other 4 hit the Swarmak, it continues to rage, to roar. Dell would go over the comms and warn Sam, look, they might even be in there. They might still be in that building, and those missiles might have connected with their friends and hurt him. Sam has to quickly apologize, and then she knows that she can no longer use those missile salvos while they have no sightlines on their friends. She begins panning that King Raven in that over-wide arch again, lifting up and away, but keeping close enough for the Swarmak to want to keep its eyes on them, with Coltrane now bellowing out in pure excitement. He is so hyped to be able to just throw round after round after round of this chain gun directly into that Swarmak. The distraction, though, has officially allowed JD and Dell to move up from rock to log, from log to rock, moving onto the position of that phalanx of all that swarm that had gathered up outside of that lumber mill, waiting for the Swarmak to finish it off. They grip their weapons. They're tracking them. And we move over. We flash over to where Kate is. JD Dell are ready for their attack. Sam has the attention of the Swarmak. We don't know what's happened to Oscar, the twins, and Marcus, other than the twins have just saved Oscar. But with that salvo hitting the building, causing a bit of an explosion, we're not sure if that's done more damage to the building. We're going to go over to Kate now. Kate Diaz, she is swimming with all her might below the surface of the water. The blanket of logs above her, covering her, not allowing her any passage back up to the surface. She has to find a pocket of air, though. Her lungs are starting to burn. She is starting to run out of time. She pushes up against a few. She can't find an opening, so she continues to swim forward. She pushes up against a few more logs, cannot find another opening, and then finally there it is, a little 4 or 5 inch opening between 2 of these logs, and she pushes her mouth and her nose up above the water. She's gasping for air. She's trying as much as she can to basically eat and gulp as much air as she can while she has this moment of reprieve. She would gasp and heave. What she would do next is duck back under the water, knowing she only had a little bit of a time. She had to continue her swim for the shore, toward the lumber mill, toward her friends, and she would begin looking for a second opening because her lungs could not get enough of that oxygen. She knows that she is struggling against time itself, and she goes to find another set of logs that are being pierced by the moonlight. There's a gap that she can tell that little bit of light shining through them is enough for her to get another gulp of air. But just as she gets to the edge of the water surface, something massive grips her legs like 2 tree trunks and begins ripping her downward to the bottom of this lake. And now we must go back to Oscar. They're gathering themselves from those KR missile explosions. They've moved to a handrail inside, further into the middle of that lumber mill. They see no sign of Marcus Phoenix. They don't know where he is, and in their panic, they begin to peer over these handrails. They begin looking in the next rooms, and on the ground floor, laying motionless, next to a giant paper press machine, next to this massive machine, is the motionless body of Marcus Phoenix. They begin shouting at him. They begin trying to rouse the old soldier, and with a twitch of his foot, they can breathe just a small sigh of relief because he is not dead, but he is down and out, it seems. And then the soldier, Marcus Phoenix, one of the toughest SOBs to ever roam Sarah, begins to shake the cobwebs out of his head, the guaranteed concussion from the explosion and the ensuing fall. He stands up, a trickle of blood down his forehead from the bottom of that skull cap. He has to shake it off. He has to get ready because now the Swarmak is outside. It's fighting a King Raven. The cavalry has arrived, but he cannot allow this all to be on the shoulders of those who have come to save them. Oh, no, 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 they cannot. Just outside, with that KR screaming above, Mackenzie gets a brilliant idea. She says, oh my goodness, I've got it. She yells to her twin brother Eli. She says, "You gotta help me." They run off. They come back with these two massive metal rods that have hooks on the end of them. Oscar jokes and says that he prefers his trusty combat knife, but that's not what they're for. And then Oscar begins to formulate the same plan as they are. Without having to say a word, he can see the same images that the twins have begun to put together. And he looks to Marcus. He says, "Hey, look, throw me that chain." Marcus says there's no time. There's not enough for him to throw that up there for him to wrap the chain around. Just drop me one of the hooks. Oscar will then drop the hook to Marcus Phoenix, and Marcus will attach that massive chain that we remember barricading the door earlier. It had been blown out into the main atrium along with Marcus Phoenix, and a lot of it had come unspooled. So Marcus takes that chain that they used to barricade themselves into the room earlier, attach it to that giant metal rod with the hook on the end, and the plan is formulated. It's crystal clear what they must do now. Outside, Dell, confronted now by a pouncer, but Dell ducks, weaves, gets right up into the ugly maw of this thing, takes that gnasher, sticks it into the tendrils, lets off two massive blasts from that thing like an active baby, and says, "Last meal." The beast is destroyed, ripped to shreds by the gnasher in its mouth. He's now set upon, though, by a seemingly heavily armored swarm drone lumbering at him, one foot after the next. And as Dell looks up, he sees that these two red lights are starting to converge on the middle of this drone's face, and Dell knows what it is. He's no dummy. He immediately ducks, and just as he gets out of sight and those two red lights converge, a torque bow bolt blasts through the air right past his head, hitting the drone in the face, exploding on contact, sending bone, brain mass, and everything all over the damn place. But we have a problem. Because with all this confusion, all of this distraction, there is no sign of Kate, no sign of Marcus. JD and Dell have no idea if they are alive, if they're fighting against hope at this point. They're going to split up. Dell is going to take the wood line, and JD will go across the shore. They will split from each other and meet back up at the Swarmac, and when they get there, they'll figure something out from there, because their problems now are trying to find out if they're fighting for anything other than their own survival. We return underneath the water, where Kate is struggling to get a grip on herself, on what is attacking her. Something massive has gone from grabbing onto her thigh, now wrenching itself around her chest, clasping her right hand up against her throat almost, and using the other arm to bear hug around her waist. And then she sees it, the massive form of that other speaker, the one that had been charred by the flames earlier. It had jumped into the water before the King Raven and that chain gun can blast right through it as it did its brother in arms. It's smiling at her, just as her nightmares have shown her hundreds of times before, the fear pulsating through her, the adrenaline pumping her blood even faster, but now her lungs need that air more than ever, and she has to take a breath. She has to get free of this grip, but she cannot, because all she can feel is the hold on, the tight clasp, the grinding, the sheer force of will of this speaker, not giving her a moment of reprieve. And she reaches inside of her armor. She searches for it. She pulls out the amulet, that beautiful amulet, the golden sparkling amulet that her mother had left her, where on one side that beautiful design, on the back side the sign of the locust, and she grips the diamond-like formation in her hand with the point of it pointing out between her middle and ring finger like a makeshift dagger. She struggles to get that arm free, but as she does, she rears back with all her might and asserts herself with that necklace pendant right in the eyeball of that speaker. 3, 2, 1. Oscar finishes his countdown. With his hook in hand, he leaps from that third story of the building onto the back of that mighty Swarmac, thrusting the point of that rusty hook into a part of its shoulder between the armor and the crystals. And as he gets it in, he begins pounding away at it, getting it to force itself deeper. And it is the perfect distraction that he needs, because now the Swarmac begins writhing in pain, begins to turn, trying to find what has stabbed it. But as it turns, Marcus jumps out from the the bottom floor, hooking that giant rod into its gut, into its belly. And as it turns, it's actually wrapping its legs, wrapping its feet up in that massive chain. And then they hear it. The second part of the plan has already been enacted. Mackenzie's last bomb, those little makeshift bombs that this little girl had been using to close off the corridors, to lay traps. The last one to her name, she pulled from her jacket. She places under that giant metal paper press machine. It explodes, the floor gives way, and now with the weight of that machine falling into the abyss, the chain yanking on that machine, now the Swarmak has been taken off of its stability. It's been taken off of its feet. The massive hunk of creature falling to the ground. It throws Oscar into the wall. He busts right through the brittle side of this lumber mill and comes to a rolling stop. Marcus is now thrown off to the left side into the edge of the wood line. But as this thing is turning and falling, that massive ripcord-like feature of the chain with the hook has ripped a slot in the belly of the beast wide open, exposing its innards, exposing its weakness. JD takes no time. He sees his father. He sees Marcus. He sees the rip in this Swarmak. He sights down the torque bow, allowing those two red lights to come together, converging on the open wound, converging on that gut. As soon as they come together, lets that thing go, and with a sickening thwump, explodes inside the guts, releasing an even larger gap, an even larger hole. He is now at its weakest. The Swarmak is ready and ripe for the taking, and Sam wastes no time. Samantha Byrne turns that KR back facing forward, nose down, missile salvos at the ready, lets 8 rockets go, all of them finding their mark, putting an end to the massive Swarmak as it lay on its back. Dell would have had a sigh of relief, but he hears something. He's not sure what it is. He turns to find that Kate Diaz has crawled her way out of the water, gasping for air, trying her best not to just pass out in this moment. She's mumbling something. Dell can't hear what she's trying to say, and she collapses into unconsciousness, into another nightmare. And that is how Chapter 12 closes out. We move to Chapter 13. 4 full hours have passed as Kate is trying to open her eyes and is blinded by the blazing sun above her. She closes them again, leaving the imprint of a black but blinding sun at the inside of her eyelids. When she's about to reopen them, she turns to her side to try to give her some reprieve from this blinding light. She sees JD, Dell, and Oscar sitting on logs near her, talking but in not much more than a whisper, near to their little site, their little campsite. She sees the King Raven has fully landed now. Baird's making noises, mimicking explosions, and a flight path of the King Raven like he's depicting the battle for his friends. Sam and Cole are bellowing with laughs. And if you know Marcus Phoenix well enough, it might look to an untrained eye that he's unamused. But knowing him as good as she has gotten to know him over these past few days, he is definitely enjoying the enthusiasm of his friends. Oscar would rush to Kate as she comes to, as she wakes up. She questions him where the twins are, but before she can even really get an answer, she sees about 50 feet away at the wood line. The twins are now holding sticks, playing a game that children outsiders play called Swords and Shields, a game she even used to play in her youth. She is happy that they are okay, but she wanted to know if it was okay for her to start moving. She wanted to know what their plan was. They informed her that they didn't want to move her unless they had to. They weren't sure of the length of her injuries. They weren't sure how hurt she was. So unless they had to pick her up, had to put her in the King Raven, they were going to let her just continue to rest. She would assure them she's fine. There were more important matters to discuss now. Looking out over the water, she would come to a bit of a distracted point in her life, because the amulet her mother had given her had saved her life. Her friends were back together. The people she barely knew, like Baird and Sam and Cole, had come with her newfound family, JD and Dell, to save her. Oscar would join her there on the shore, and Kate would say to him how she wished her mother, how she wished Rhaena was there fighting with them. Oscar would look at her and ask, how do you know she wasn't? How do you know her spirit was not here with us this whole time, helping us to succeed in this most dire of situations? And he would hug her with a single arm embrace, the re-injuring of that same arm injured in Gears 4, where he had fallen, where he had tripped on his way to the lumber mill, the pain still searing, but the combat adrenaline making it numb for the time being, now set back in with the lull in action. It wouldn't take long, though, for Kate's attention to turn to what should come next, where they should take the twins. Would it be New Ephyra? She would ask him again, but this time it was less of a question and more of an emphatic statement, and Oscar would simply reply to her, Riftworm. She tilted her head, unsure of what he meant. Riftworm? He would tell her that Riftworm was a village far, far to the north, an outsider village. She asked if it would be safe there, and he would ask her the exact same thing about New Ephyra. The argument this time would get them nowhere, they decided. They knew that arguing amongst the two of them about where safety was would not push them forward. It would not get them the desired effect. And that the twins themselves had earned the right through battle hardness to decide where they would go. They would call them over and begin giving their pitches. Kate for New Ephyra, Oscar for Riftworm. They would allow the twins to decide for themselves who they went with. But whoever they went with, the other would not join them. It would not convince the other party to go just because the twins had decided to go with the other. Kate assured them, though, that if they went to New Ephyra, it would not get them any closer to the front line. They would not be able to continue to fight Swarm. They would go to New Ephyra for safety, for protection. The twins turned. They had almost a silent conversation between the two of them, just barely murmurs, before turning back and giving Kate Diaz a massive hug, which would let both of them know that they had already made up their minds. They would go with Oscar. They would stay with their makeshift uncle and go to Riftworm. Oscar inquired after having Sam offered to take them there, or having Kate offered to take them in the King Raven. Sam would have to inform them they couldn't go all the way to Riftworm. They barely had enough fuel to get them back to New Ephyra, so Oscar would simply ask if she could take them to a supply stash in a building about 20 miles north of their position. This was wholly acceptable by Sam's standards, and they would all load up into the King Raven. Kate kind of laughing at how normally Oscar would be too stubborn to accept any help, but he was more than happy to fly the 20 miles than have to walk them. As they approached the makeshift supply storage shed, JD and Dell would hop out of the King Raven first and do a perimeter sweep, ensuring that no swarm were there, that nobody was there to present any threat. Oscar would go off to a log and dislodge a hidden old rusty key and begin opening the door. Inside was ammo, food, supplies, enough to keep them happy, to refill their stomachs, to prepare them for the rest of this walk toward Riftworm, toward the new outsider village. And after 20 minutes or so, Mackenzie, Eli, and Oscar would decide it was time to go. Mackenzie and Eli would give Kate one more massive hug, and then they would run over and, to everyone's shock, give Marcus a hug as well. The old soldier had grown on them quite fondly in the past few days of all the fighting, of all the adventuring they had been through. And then they turned to head for the forest, giving a haphazard wave as they made it to the wood's edge and disappeared. Oscar, a few feet behind them, turned completely 180 degrees to give Kate a final wave goodbye. And it was in this moment that Kate Diaz reflected on what she had gone through. She thought she lost her uncle Oscar the same night she lost her mother Rhaena to that snatcher. She thought he was gone and dead forever. And when she was rescued by him at South Village, she was so relieved, she was so happy. But now she was losing him again, except this time it was just a little different, because this time she would be able to say goodbye on her own terms. And then he disappeared into the wood's edge, and we end chapter 13. In chapter 14, we come back with the whole group being in New Ephyra. It had been about a week. About a full 7 days had passed since the group had returned to New Ephyra. But the first people we join in chapter 14 are Jin and Baird, standing on a railing about 40 feet above the factory floor. It was abuzz with the construction down below of as many robots going hard and fast as they could, but keeping quality control at the highest standard. Baird nods his head and would proclaim to Jin that about 50 DR1s a day, that's what they would be able to produce at this rate. 50 DR1s, and Jin would answer quite quickly they needed more. They needed more than that. They needed more out of this factory, but for now, all of their resources would be pointed toward this. And she knew that it was all that they could manage. She would remind him that she also ordered better, stronger, faster, smarter bots, ones that could withstand the swarm. Baird was happy to report that Cole had made leaps and bounds on the smart department. Cole had actually helped Baird develop a brand new playbook, a thrashball playbook if you'd like to use that term. Coltrane, a master in learning offense and defense through his old thrashball playbook, had helped Baird come up with various situational combat programs for the DBs, site containment, all-out offensive. Neither, though, are what Jin was exactly looking for. You see, Jin wanted and suggested something different. She wanted evacuation protocols because her plan was to bring every living human to New Ephyra. Baird didn't like the idea. He reminded her that the swarm are somehow tracking, patrolling, attracted to the humans. They wanted to snatch them all up and make them one amongst their ranks. He would basically make the metaphor that she was putting all of her eggs in the proverbial New Ephyra basket. He would say that when the entire swarm came for all of the last humans, she would need something to help kill them off. And Jin knew what he was getting at, but no, oh hell no, you are not putting the Hammer of Dawn back online, not on her watch, because right now what was most important was not how to take life, but how to conserve lives, how to save as many humans, because after many, many years, the Pendulum Wars, the Locust Wars, E-Day, all the way up to V-Day, with Adam Phoenix's final solution killing off all forms of lambency on the planet, the human population was scarcely low. They had to focus their efforts on saving lives. Baird would scratch his chin, Sam walking up behind him, taking position to his left. She has seen that look before. She knew his frustration was high. But then he would throw his hands out with his palms up, almost surrendering and obliging to her, knowing what he now had to do. And he would get her as many new and well-programmed in all forms of evacuation, offensive, site containment, whatever it must be, these badass bots would be hers come hell or high water. This conversation would wind down, and suddenly behind them would be finishing up their own tour of the facilities, JD, Dell, Marcus, and Kate. Baird would move right past First Minister Jin, giving JD and Dell a welcomed embrace. And Sam would move up on her own, giving Kate a soldier's hug. You know, they had gotten quite close over these last 7 days. I can only imagine the kind of conversations that they would have, having put up with basically the same people for so long at this point, having the same family. First Minister Jin would come up the rear and welcome the group to the conversation, but she would first welcome Kate Diaz. But she wouldn't refer to her as Kate, not as Miss Diaz. Oh no. Kate would be welcomed as Corporal Diaz, because as we suddenly learn through that piece of information, Kate has no longer become an outsider. She is now A cog corporal, ladies and gentlemen. She has joined the ranks of the coalition of ordered governments. Kate would salute her first minister. A little shaky, but a salute nonetheless. She was still getting used to the cog way of life. Del wasted no breath, though, no time. He asked straight away if they were ready to wipe the swarm out, and Jin would politically give the answer eventually. She would elaborate just as a politician would, though, saying the bare minimum, that she would need all of their help, even motioning to Marcus Phoenix off in the distance, and Marcus about 10 feet behind JD, Del, and Kate. He wouldn't say no, he'd merely look up at her, and sometimes with Marcus Phoenix, that's all you could hope for. That was the best answer, was a non-answer, giving us the hints of what is to come that we need. That ends Chapter 14. That ends the main book, Gears of War Ascendance, but we have a final portion. The epilogue of Gears of War Ascendance, aptly named Morning Star. It was the dead of night. Damon Baird was slowly moving through the gardens outside of his mansion in New Ephyra, moving up to the gates where off to his left are DR1 protectors silently standing guard, and he moved to his private workshop, opening it with the old rusty key at the turning, and after a moment hears the click of the door locking behind him. He would move to that bookshelf that would give way to the staircase to his private security room. It would creak as it revealed the steps, and he reminded himself that he needs to oil it up so as not to make so much noise anymore, and smiled at himself for his work as he enters the room. The same room that we have seen several times in this book that we saw at the beginning of Gears 4. The screens all dark. Nothing being read on them for now because his back door to the DB feeds was ordered to be cut off. It was now illegal for him to be able to keep watch on his bots. He turned everything on, though, and the monitors sprang to life one at a time, the computers whirring up, coming to life, and his AI, Iris, would come over the loudspeaker and would welcome him. She would remind him that it had been quite some time since Damon had come to this workshop so late at night. And she asked if there was trouble with Sam, and this was not a troubled man. No, this was a man on a mission. This was something much more than that, something important, something secret. He would tell Iris there could be no permanent database of this session, no record that he had been here. He had set up a separate file for her to use, a separate spot for her to keep this information. As he took a seat in front of his computer, he would open a drawer in front of him, and before closing it again, he would actually find a data disk. He would rifle through a bunch of them, but find a data disk with a white dot on the top, a very inconspicuous looking white dot. And, excuse me, if you weren't looking for it specifically, if you weren't trying to find that data disk, you would have never known that it was anything special. He would enter it into the computer, and Iris began whirring up. She took a long, hard look at the data contents and said, there is a passlock, a passcode, a phrase that you must enter before you can access any of the information on this disk. Baird says, I know, I'm the one that put it there. The passcode was look to the sky. As the machines began to whir up, as Iris would be let loose on all the data possible inside of this disk, the first thing she would mention was that 87% of the files on this disk were written and authored by one Adam Phoenix, the father to Marcus Phoenix, the grandfather to JD, the hero of the Locust and the Pendulum Wars, the man that came up with the Hammer of Dawn that put the Pendulum Wars to rest because the UIR would no longer be willing to fight. The man who came up with the emulsion solution that killed off anything, whether it be lambent or locust. That same hero, Adam Phoenix, authored this disc. This was his personal files, his personal recollection. Baird pondered if the old man still had any secrets left to hide, what the other 13% were authored by. He scanned the data, looking for any semblance of anything he might have missed, anything he might have overlooked, any information, anything that could give them a little bit of insight into this. And there it was. A word he was not sure had he overlooked before. A word he was unsure if he had missed all these times. A man as studious as Damon Baird, he pondered. And he measured out a single word, and it is the last word we read in this book, and it harkens back to a place we have been, a place where we last saw Adam Phoenix, the only clue Baird could possibly imagine. The word he whispers, the word he measures. Azura. The secret island facility. Ladies and gentlemen, that ends Gears of War Ascendance. I am Colin Clark. I thank you for joining me as you have in the past videos. Go and pick up this book. If you have enjoyed my reviews, you will enjoy reading it for yourself even more. The author, Jason M. Hugh, does a magnificent, a masterful job of writing it out, keeping us waiting with bated breath, with each word depicting one just as amazing as the last. And do not forget to join me in September, less than 30 days from now. If you get the early access September 6th, if you get the regular access September 10th, join me and continue the journey on Sarah, continue the journey of Gears of War. Join us, join me with this magnificent story and these incredible characters in Gears 5. Thank you so much to each and every person that has watched, subscribed, liked. Thank you to everybody that has joined me on these last two streams. I appreciate you more than you will ever know. I'm Colin Clark, signing off. Have a great rest of your day.